At this point, I'd like to ask Dr. Malosi to introduce our presenter.
Hi, I'm Martin Malosi. I'm the director of the Center for Public History, and welcome, especially on a Friday afternoon. I know how precious time this is for everybody, so we're very happy that you're here. I really shouldn't have to read anything because Dwight was one of our prize students in our graduate program, and I've known him for many, many years before he went on to greater glory. And we're very, very happy to have him back to his presentation. He's currently at Texas State University in San Marcos and an associate professor of history. And his specialty, I think, which kind of comes through in the work he's discussing today, is in African American history, civil rights history, police and violence, and those are kind of core, and certainly Houston history too. He's been interested, I think, over the course of his career in how race and law impact United States history, and also he's been a kind of participant as well as a scholar. So I think he comes from the two worlds that are important, the academic world and then that world beyond, and I think that gives his work some important credibility. His book, A Change Did Come, Race in the Houston Police Department, 1930-1982, is still a book that is widely used, and unlike a lot of our scholarship, it's used outside of the classroom and used by a number of people throughout the country. Also, aside from his work as a historian, Dwight is a special assistant to the provost and founder of the Neighborhood Mentoring Program for junior faculty and students at Texas State University. So, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dwight.
Thank you. It is always good to come home. I lived in Houston for a long time before I moved to Austin, Texas area. I now live in Kyle, Texas, and I've been at Texas State University for the last 18 years. Today I want to talk to you about the issues surrounding the death and the first trial of the officers charged in the homicide of Jose Campos Torres. But before I do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about my background because it's important to you to understand how I reached some of the conclusions I came to. For 9 years of my life, I was a parole, probation, or assistant warden in a prison. And I was also a licensed prisoner transport officer and traveled all over the country doing that. And got out of that area and went back to graduate school, and I'm here now. As a scholar of African American history, you can not separate activism from scholarship. If you are worth your snot, you'll stand up for what is right, and you will speak the truth to power with power. Today, I am talking about Jose Campos Torres and the tragedy that happened in May of 1977. On the evening of May 5th, 1977, Jose Campos Torres, a veteran of military service who had been summarily dismissed from the military, largely due to the fact of, they say, insubordination and alcoholism, which was a tragic problem in the Vietnam War era, was drinking at a bar on Canal Street. He knew the man, and the man knew him. Torres had drunk there often, and they had fought often. This evening, the fight was particularly aggressive, and he called the Houston Police Department. Now, Jose was no stranger to the Houston Police Department. Jose himself said that the police department likes to arrest Mexicans. And Jose, in an extreme state of inebriation, gets into a fight with the arresting officers. That fight boils over into 6 or 7 officers to put him into custody and take Jose to jail. As a result of that, Jose would receive some injuries. And those injuries would keep Jose from being admitted to the jail. And they were ordered to take Jose to the charity hospital in the city, which was Ben Taub Hospital at the time. By this time, there had been 2 fights. One fight we knew about, one fight you didn't know about. Well, it was part of the public record. The second fight had occurred in what they call the dead zone. It's a spot over off of Bayou that people would sit in at night. People worked a lot. Salaries weren't that great. I remember a police officer friend of mine says, hey man, you have to hustle a little bit. You have to work extra to take care of your family. And that was a common trend in that period. So this isn't an issue about people being fatigued. This is an issue about violence and what happens as a consequence of violence. And so Torres, on that night, May 5th, 1977, has 3 fights with the same group of police officers. And so let me give you the background. Houston police during the 1970s had undergone several high-profile and dramatic shootings of Randy Webster, a white suburban young man, and Billy Keith Jovis. Both cases ended with the use of what they call the throwdown weapon. During the fight, and what could possibly be explained as contributory negligence or an accident becomes a criminal act by the use of a weapon to try to protect oneself. Now, I'm not trying to justify anything, I'm trying to give you the explanation given to me. And so it is important to understand that the human nature seems to always be to protect oneself, not to do what is right sometimes in a system where the ultimate punishment can be your life in jail. Now, again, I'm not justifying anything, I'm explaining it to you. So, I say that to say that in the case of Jovis and Webster, they were paid monetary sums, the families were paid monetary sums, but it signaled something to the community at large and to the police themselves. It signaled to the communities at large that the police were now attacking white citizens of the city of Houston. Minorities had always complained about police brutality. As a matter of fact, if you're going back to the 1940s forward, blacks coming home from the military had been attacked nationwide. Mary Frances Berry, in her new book on civil rights in Alabama, talks about officers being murdered in their uniforms as a message to send home in rural areas of Alabama and in Birmingham and other places like that. My father came home World War II from Burma and was told to get out of his uniform. Boy, you ain't in the Army no more on Veterans Day. My father happened to be 6'5", 270 pounds, so I don't think he changed his uniform he changed that day. But Vance Muse tells us what people thought of the Houston police about this time. Mayor Hoffines kind of echoed that. He said them were some mean dudes. Do you have to be mean to do the job, I asked. Harry Cobwell said, you bet your ass, you bet your ass. Torres' death raised several questions. Did race play a factor? What were the responsibilities of the police? Where is the oversight of the police? And then finally, how do you hold the city accountable for what men do? All of these would be placed on trial during what would ultimately become the trial of the police officers involved in the event. Torres was born in Houston, 1953. Jose Luna Torres and Margaret Torres. He was a Vietnam Era veteran, and he had served in the elite mountain combat unit. His commanding officer or first sergeant said, Torres could have been a hell of a soldier. but the spirits got him. Yeah, the spirits got him. Referencing Torres's alcohol addiction. The city of Houston had sustained tremendous growth. And in the 1970s, a reclassification of Mexican Americans by the United States Census Board made Mexican Americans an ethnic qualification rather than a Caucasian qualification. And statistical numbers of Mexicans began to grow in the city of Houston. Now, prior to this, most things in the city of Houston were talked about as a biracial issue, not a multi or triracial issue within the city. Didn't mean that Mexican Americans didn't exist. It just meant that their politics and their culture was largely ignored by those who made decisions. And those who were of Spanish heritage, which they said they were, rather than Mexican American heritage, they said they were Spanish. And many of the people who worked with the police in what they call special categories prior to this did this so by saying they were part of what they call the Spanish squad or the Latin squad. They were not the Mexican squad, for that was a pejorative term in the minds of many of those people who were members of LULAC and others at that time. One such person was Manuel Crespo, funeral home owner, who told them he was of Castilian blood and was not a Mexican. And he was a special police officer in times of crisis within the Houston Spanish or Mexican community. So with that said, as the sustained growth of the city occurred and Houston becomes a population anomaly, during the Great Migration, Houston becomes one of the major southern cities with an inward migration. And don't get me wrong, Houston is a southern city, it's not a western city. Houston is a southern city. And they want to situate it close to the south, but Houston's a southern city in terms of folkways, racial attitudes, and how it operates. And so Houston has an inward flux of people starting in the early 20s all the way up through the 1980s. And this inward migration of people will make it explode in population, and that exponential growth in population will make Houston one of the largest cities in America. But with that, political attitudes, institutional attitudes don't change as fast. Growth brings with it some logical and illogical things. And one of the most illogical things is to think that institutions change like people. They don't. As a matter of fact, I want you to hang on to this one. Police, as an agency, have a lag time in when a decision is made to change a policy until that decision becomes part of the mindset of the department. There is an immediate part of that policy that may be implemented. We can't do that anymore, but what happens in crisis, what happens when there's tension, then you don't see that manifest itself. It takes a while. And why is that? Because you still have the same training officers, you still have the same field officers, and that methodology has to be worked out of the force itself. And to be very honest with you, most people have a lag time as to when decisions that are thrust upon them impact or affect them as well. And so during this period, Torres is at the bar. They've gotten into a hell of a fight, as the cop said. And Torres is in the back seat of the car and he is screaming. I mean, he's mad. He's been handcuffed. Now half of the fight, Torres is handcuffed. Over half of the fight. Torres is saying to the officers as they drive him to the jail, if you let me out this car, I will whoop you get it. And he called them everything but a child of God. And an inebriated man who's had a fight with you is not gonna back down. And so as they drove to jail, there was a new rule within the jail itself, and that was, if an injured person comes, he has to be checked out by medical personnel. Well, they signed him in that night, and they got him there. Then the jailer looked at Torres and says, no, you gotta take him to the hospital. They made a decision. Again, it's late. Again, it's time to get off work. They decide on the way, and I do believe that the guy said it was a spontaneous thing. Let's just let him go. Now, was it right? No. Was it sound judgment? No. He was drunk. He had already been hurt. So they did what was easy and not what was right. They decide, again, Torres is still belligerent. I found that hard to accept. I was thinking maybe he would have passed out by that time, until I did a study of alcoholism. And there is a certain baseline you reach if you're an alcoholic, and you don't get any drunker. And so Torres logically could have been absolutely inebriated and still awake, still angry, still hostile. And after I looked at that study, then I started to realize how he could function, And so as they left the jail, Torres started in on him again. He harangued him that night. He called him everything but a child of God and something else. And he finally pushed the button. He said, you damn pigs, I'll beat all y'all ass. And these are his exact words. So they pull over. They go back to the dead zone. They pull over. And by this time, the radio call goes out and some other officers show up. And they're on Bayou. And this fight goes on for about 45 minutes to an hour. But this time there's a rookie with them, and his name was Carlos Edwards. Edwards has seen this, and he's afraid. His father is a police officer. What do I do? I'm a rookie. There is a thing called the Blue Code. It isn't anything written. It's a brotherhood. It's an esprit de corps that happens when you do the similar work in tough situations. And so you don't rat out on each other. You don't tell it on each other. But in this case, there were acceptable limits of aggression and unacceptable limits of aggression. And during the fight with Torres that night, somebody crossed those lines. So during the fight, Torres was struck with billy clubs and fists. Now, we don't know how many blows were thrown, but we do know that there were 7 men present and 7 grown men fighting one man. Now, we don't know during the fight if they were throwing blows simultaneously or what, but we do know that Torres, the bottom of his feet were bruised, and he had on military jump boots, and they are steel toed. So after the fight, and the fight goes on for 45 minutes, Torres is taken out of handcuffs. He's on the edge of the bayou, and Carlos Edwards' famous words in the newspaper is, "Oh my God, he's in the bayou." The afternoon paper said they've thrown him in the bayou. Edwards in trial says he simply saw Torres, he heard Torres was in the water. Which one was it? It doesn't matter. They were responsible for Torres. And they said they let him go to swim home. Now, all of this would have been fine if Torres had survived, made it home. It may have been a lawsuit of some kind, but it would have been his word against the officers, except for one thing. Does anybody know what it was? Any students here? Remember I told you he signed into the jail on the blotter. They said they hadn't seen him. Torres drowned that night after the fight. They found his body floating 3 days later. And Torres' aunt went in to the sheriff's department and others and filed a complaint with the police and sheriffs. And at that point, it was clear that a crime had been committed. Torres had drowned. It was dark, they couldn't see, they didn't know if he had made it to the other side. So what wrong had they done in their minds? They had let him go. They were negligent. He was their responsibility, according to the rules that existed within HPG. So as the officers let Torres go and Torres drowns, a boat operator. Now, I couldn't imagine this when I was a student here, that somebody was on a boat sightseeing on Bayou. You know, maybe it wasn't as bad as it was when I first got here, but I just couldn't imagine that. But a sightseeing tour on Bayou, the boat operator hooks the body and pulls Torres's body up to the boat, and the coroner's office picks up the body, and Joseph Jihimchek conducts the autopsy. Jihimchek was considered one of the best of the county or city coroners. He was extremely good at his job and extremely thorough. He ruled Torres's death asphyxiation, drowning, homicide. Not only did Torres fight, but Torres' body was battered from head to the bottom of his feet. And even after 3 days, the bruises were still present on his body. Badly bloated, and swollen body was pulled out of the bayou and identified by the aunt. Now, in some cities, that would have been the story. But an emerging Mexican-American activist strata had begun in Houston at that time. A group of people who didn't mind being Mexican, a group of people who wanted people to know that they were proud of being Mexican, and they began to ask questions. People frustrated with the treatment of young folks. You see, Torres's death was 10 years after the riot at Texas Southern in May of 1967, where Officer Kuba was killed by a ricocheting bullet. So there's a history of masked aggression in the city. So now we have a body. So what do? The police department has said they didn't know where Torres was. Pappy Bond steps down, and Harry Caldwell is now chief. Harry Caldwell immediately says, we have to do something about this. Carlos Edwards, who told his father about it the next day, is suspended along with 7 other men. And as a result of that, grand jury comes back and files criminal charges against men involved in the incident. And they're going to go to trial. So the community at this point begins to galvanize around one issue: the use of violence to maintain social control in the city. That is when African-American leaders and Mexican-American leaders, for one of the first times in the city of Houston, sit down and talk together with one another and come up with some kind of strategic plan to address the issues. They all agree that they will let the courts handle it, but they also say that they must keep the pressure on. And so with this said, the Harris County Prosecutor's Office will push for the case of murder. Now, I found something that's very difficult to do. You cannot convict an officer of murder in the commission of his duty. You're just not going to do it. I've only seen it done once. And this was a guy who shot his wife at her job in Arizona. But you're not going to convict him of murder. And I asked my friend who was the first black prosecutor in Arkansas, in Phillips County, why did they do that? He says, did they do it with lesser and included offenses? He said, I said, no. He said they didn't want to find him guilty because he knew it wasn't going to happen. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I just knew what they charged him with, and I knew what they went to court with. And so, how does the trial play out? Well, with the star witness, Patrolman Elliott, who feared for himself, and he couldn't keep quiet because his father had taken him to the chief, and they had reported. And with the startling facts of Jahimchek's report, there was due cause to file for some case of homicide. But was it murder? And I say it that way because that's how the court is going to operate. Was it murder? A man was dead. In my mind, it's murder. But under the eyes of the law that you are trying to convict a jury of, would it be murder? So as the trial starts, and it takes a while to get to trial, I'll tell you that much, the officers and the mayor, Fred Hoffines Jr., said that George Strong's makes a statement. He says the mayor was really in a tough spot after the Torres incident. He initially denounced the police, but then he supported them, and then he had to denounce them again because it was clear that they were wrong, and it was his political suicide in the city. Because nobody wanted to believe that police officers would do that. So here is the collateral damage starting to occur. The chief steps down. The mayor won't be reelected, you see. And now we're getting ready to go to trial. And when we go to the first trial, the officers, during the trial, Taurus is put on trial, and I talked to Racehorse Haynes. And Racehorse Haynes was the lawyer. And Racehorse says, you know what? I got change of venue. And he was real excited about it. I got change of venue. I wouldn't be worth my snot if I didn't put up a good defense, huh? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, and he put his cowboy boots on the desk. And he talked to, if anybody knows Racehorse Haynes, he had on some crocodile cowboy boots. He smacked them on the desk and they were shining like glass. And he says, yeah, change of venue. I knew if I got down to Walker County or something like that, hell, I wasn't gonna get no conviction. He got off with 1 year. 2 years, one suspended, and the judge made a statement that they wouldn't do it again. And they set the convictions aside. So what's going to happen? All of the men were fired. Ironically, 2 get their job back. 1 had been involved in the Webster case, and he retired from the police force. The others, the 2 that would ultimately go to jail in the second trial, did not. So here is what the prosecutor said. There was a malicious and deliberate attempt to do bodily harm to Torres. Burke Graham, who was the partner with Ted Poe, who is now the Republican representative from this area. He was a prosecutor, then a judge. Ted Poe's nickname was Toothbrush, because if you were going up against Ted Poe and Burke Graham, you need to bring your toothbrush because you're going to jail. That's his nickname. Burke Graham said they had him dead to right, and they knew it, but when Racehorse changed the venue, he knew that they were in trouble. They tried to renegotiate the charges, but they couldn't. And so finally, I want you to put yourself in the position of a man fighting for his or her life. The man said, I lost it. Denton said, I lost it. I got mad. He spit in my face, and I lost it. Is that a justification for that kind of violence? You lost it. Anybody at any given moment can say no to it. But what happens when you're in the heat of that fight? What troubled me about it, and what troubled Burke Graham, and Burke Graham says this, he said, put yourself in Torres's place. How do you feel? Not one person on the jury looked like Torres that day. They couldn't empathize with what Burke Graham says. He said when he looked at the jury, he realized he had lost them. But more appropriately, he looked at how the judge ruled and cut them off at places when they were making headway. And he said, we got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. So with the set aside, the U.S. attorney gets involved in the next case. And the next case is a federal court. So the federal prosecutor, Tony Canales and Ms. Sanderson, decided that they're going to charge him with homicide under the federal statute initially, and then they reduce it to manslaughter or second-degree murder manslaughter, lesser and included offenses. They're ultimately convicted. And the reason why I'm not telling you about the second trial, because the students here, I like them to ask questions. So I want to talk to you about it, because it's really interesting what happens in the second trial. Because the federal process is different. The police all come to trial. They're all dressed like they're going to church. And by this time, it's 2 years down the line. It's 1978, 79. Second trial comes. Federal Judge Ross Sterling takes over the trial. And Ross Sterling is a no-nonsense law and order guy. But he does some really unique things in the trial. Number one, Sterling limits the evidence that can be used, and he does not allow certain testimonies that were introduced in the first trial to be used in the second trial. Number two, when they were found guilty, he overrode the recommendation for sentencing. And when he overrode the recommendation for sentencing, the administrative court, district court, challenged Sterling. And Sterling sued the administrative court and district court, and the district court had to rule that Sterling did have the authority to do it, but they didn't think it was wise. They were sentenced to 10 years, two of the men. Sterling reduced it to 1 year, and they suspended sentence the rest of it, saying that this was an isolated event and that they would not do it again if they had to. I asked in my book, Torres would never live again. So did the judge consider that in his decision-making process? Burke Graham said when he read that from Sterling, he just kind of hung his head. He says, because I saw the evidence. The supreme irony of this is one of the men who were most guilty, the sergeant, got his job back. The man who was supposed to be the barrier, the threshold, let's stop. Okay, we messed up, but let's stop this. The others did not. One became a preacher, two became teachers, and the others I wasn't able to track down. Torres becomes a symbol, a permanent symbol of police oppression. And everybody who came to Texas and lived in Houston knows the name Jose Campos Torres. Thank you.
So I assume that you wanted to take questions. So
Oh, yeah.
I'll let you take them rather than.
Yeah.
me. So anybody has a question or comment, please feel free.
At which trial, was it the first or the second trial? I had heard that one of the testimonies, the young officer.
Young officer.
Cop, he had revealed to his dad, was his dad still
His,
active?
his dad had retired by the second trial, was about to retire, was going through retirement at the second trial. And that was Carlos Edwards. He was a young officer.
These are white officers?
These are white officers. Now, two of the officers were of Mexican or Latin origin, Orlando, and another one. They were Mexican or Latin origin. What's his name? Yes. I can't think of his name, but I had a picture of him. But yeah, they looked Mexican to me, bro. I'm sorry,
What was the name of Joseph what?
Jonas, yeah. Jonas. He had a Polish father and a Mexican mother. Mm-hmm.
So at which trial then does, I had understood that it was the young rookie officer who testified also, and that as he was walking away, when he had heard this, he had gotten a call and he was leaving, as I understand.
He was in the car. And he didn't want to participate in the second fight, in the fight. He didn't participate in either fight. He was in the car, and he had his head down because he could hear the blows. And first he said he could hear the blows, and the second time he said he didn't want to look. And then he looked up, and he said, "Oh God, he's gone. He's in the bayou." And that's when they said they let him swim across the bayou. You see, that was the first and second trial. That testimony came out. But in the second trial, they limited it to what he actually saw. And that's when they either pushed or he jumped, came in. Okay, but in the first trial, he said they pushed him.
I was having a conversation with, and I'm sorry,
Yeah.
last thing, I was having a conversation with someone who was familiar with the incident.
Yeah.
They had mentioned to me that the young rookie officer, when he testified, repeated some of the things that he had heard by other officers.
Yes.
And what he said was that he had heard these officers say, "Let's see if this wetback can swim."
Oh, those were the exact words. They were in the newspaper. That day. "Let's see if the wetback can swim." Torres said to them, even during the fight, he yelled, "If you take these handcuffs off me, I'll kick all your pig's ass." So Torres was defiant even to the end. By this time, man, I've fought before, okay, y'all. I've been in a fight or two. But I can't imagine two fights in one night and I'm drunk. Or even half drunk. I can't imagine two fights. The second fight, he had nothing left. There was nothing for him to swim. He couldn't swim across the bayou. Jim Check said he was physically impossible for him to swim across the bayou.
Was he still in handcuffs when he went into the bayou?
No, he was out of handcuffs. They had took the handcuffs off to let him go. Yeah. But in the first fight he was, and part of the second fight. Halfway through this fight, now this is unclear. One officer said halfway through the fight they took his handcuffs off. The other one said they took his handcuffs off after the fight. I don't know. But that's where the judge starts to step in and says, well, which one is it? And the prosecutor Burke Graham says, I kind of jumped at it, but the judge did this, and Sterling didn't play. Because Burke Graham consulted with the federal attorneys. Tony Canales began to represent the Southern District as the marshal in that area for a while. And then he went back as a U.S. attorney from the Southern District out of Corpus. And Sanderson retired, the lady who tried the case. After that, she was no longer a federal attorney at that time, after that. Yes?
Could you speak a bit about the Moody Park riot and what
Yes.
outcome came from?
Well, the big thing about the Moody Park riot was the frustration that grew out of the lack of a positive conviction or affirmation of the death of Torres. Mexican Americans and African Americans and others were there, and we have a police officer in the room who worked at that period. And I think it's important, and I want to commend him for coming, but you know, I knew Denny Hare well at the police academy and some other guys, and they said the same thing. Tensions were high on both sides, and there was just a flashpoint. They were really frustrated with what happened in the trial, and legitimately so. Travis Morales and others were at the park, and they were trying to see what the outcome of the trial was going to be. At that point, tensions, there was a flashpoint. Some say somebody threw something at the police, and some say there was an order to move in. I don't know. I wasn't there, but I do know what the paper said, and I do know what the documents, internal documents said, that something was thrown at the police. You know, there were some fires that night. There were some bricks and rocks thrown, but I don't know what started it because that was still unclear. But the riot's significance is a temporary effort at group cohesion on the part of the Mexican American community, and by 1980 you begin to see the legitimization of that presence on city council and other stuff. And you see it again in 1981 with Judson Robinson. Judson Robinson comes in 1971, but in 82 you see this large mass of minorities elected to the city council. Yes.
My recollection is that there was an attempt at an ad hoc citizens review board.
Yes.
That came
Yes.
together. And it was not official in any way, but it was an opportunity to.
It was an opportunity to air grievances, and they took leaders from various segments of the community and brought them together to talk to people, to try to vent frustrations and stuff. The best thing that grew out of that ad hoc citizens board is it birthed the political leaders. Ben Reyes was on it. Some of the younger people who had been at University of Houston had been part of that group called PAL that was there. Had come out of that thing. So yeah, that ad hoc thing. But another long-term effect of the ad hoc board was the idea that there should be some kind of oversight, and that we should have the police situated within the community. Now, the big problem in Texas with the idea of long-term community policing is the idea of the fact that most people who are members of the police force, probably 50, at one point as high as 51% in some forces, don't live in the communities that they serve. Most people, a lot of people, and I don't know what the statistics are now, but at that point when I was looking at them, and this is in the 90s, probably at that time you probably had 30-40% that didn't live in Houston at all, and had never lived in Houston, so they had no kind of societal relation to the people that they served. And this is a problem nationwide, so this isn't just a Houston problem. In many police forces, you have to at least live in the county that you serve on at a urban police force. You have to at least live in the county that you're part of. Yes, sir.
Is there any clear evidence that the Torres case had a salutary effect on police reform
Yes.
in Houston?
Major,
Direct line?
very direct line. They would come about with they change standards for training. They improve training at the police academy. They bring in different trainers. They add some higher requirements for educational requirements. They move from high school diploma to, I think, 30 hours, and then they did go to 60, but they rejected 90. And they have not thrown out the idea that military service is comparable to that. But there were some, in terms of, then there were some statutory things in terms of the law, how the law looks at it statewide. The state did a couple of things, and one of the biggest things the state did was how the idea of lesser and included offenses in the judicial process.
This is internally motivated? There's external.
Most of these are external pressures, but internally it brought about an idea that actually the police after Torres initially kind of sequestered themselves upon themselves, and then internally things kind of went to hell under Harry Caldwell. I'll be very honest with you, you know, and that's what the police themselves said. Things went to hell, and I talked to enough of them at the academy who said it. And you know, Harry wouldn't interview with me. He was the only one that was around that wouldn't interview. He wanted to. He was quite suspicious because when I told him who I was and what I was talking about, but everybody else talked about it, but he wouldn't talk. You know, he's got a big voice. Well, how you doing? That's Harry's voice on the phone. I mean, he sounds like he's sitting next to you in the room. Well, let me see. And then about 2 months later, he called back. I don't think I can do that. You know, and so, and then on top of that, you know, very few people actually liked him. You know, they were suspicious of him more than anything. You know, and plus after that, there was some other fallout. Pappy Bond, I don't know what Pappy's problem was. I think he suffered from some kind of depression because he committed suicide later. Some say it was directly attributable to that and those cases, but I don't think so. I think Pappy had some other issues, but you know, the press said that the stress may have brought it on.
I had a question.
Yeah, just
The young officer that testified.
Yeah.
So he broke that blue code.
Well, he did, but he broke that blue code in a self-preservation mode more than he did anything else because he didn't participate in the beating at all.
So, but what happened?
His father told him that he had to. He told his father this. He knew it was wrong, and his father took him to the chief, and he reported at that point. His father took him. What happened? They suspended him. They fired him. He got fired like the rest of them. All of them will ultimately get fired, and 2 will get their job back, and then 1 gets suspended again, and that's permanent. And then his suspension is permanent. You know. Yes.
And Dr. Melosi's commented on this as well, but you said that this event galvanized activism among the Black and Hispanic communities here. And I guess I'm wondering, as a historian, would you like to expound upon the notion of a horrifying event like this as the impetus for social change across a community? Is that something that? Well, if you look at most of the clarion calls for police reform grow out of tragedy. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the idea, the shootings, the well-publicized shootings now, we want to say it's an epidemic, but statistics as a historian, they don't bear out to say it's an epidemic, but it is a problem, and it's a major problem, the use of deadly force, and the selective use of deadly force, and the idea of implicit bias and explicit bias playing a part in how you do your job. And that's a major problem today. And so, yeah, unfortunately, most police reform in American society happens after somebody is in a coma or dead. And if you look at the major police reform measures, going back to the 1920s with the third degree issue, the Wickersham Commission, Knapp Commission, all these other major commissions, LEA, LEP, all that stuff, they usually grow out of some tragic circumstance or some urban unrest. Yes, sir.
I just, you said something about, you seem to situate this in a time of Houston growing pains in Houston, or growing faster, or becoming,
yes,
maybe changing, I guess.
Houston, yeah, I did.
It's become a different place, yet the institutions are kind of these legacy institutions, yes, that are operate under the old rules.
Yeah.
And so this is that, and it seems like a watershed moment here where change is being pushed, but the change comes slowly, if at all, right? You could argue, yes, still the health care system here in Houston is a legacy system. Yes. There are lots of legacies that are still around. But what I'm trying to think about is how that racial formula changes in Houston around this time, and whether a police force and a city that had been operating under just sort of race as a black-white phenomenon, yeah, is now confronting a much more complicated sense of race, and how that how that is
Good question.
reflected in these events?
Well, one thing comes out of this in terms of the complications, the complexities of race is 1981, 1980-81, you get the Barbara Jordan suit coming down with the 951 rule, which changed the complexity of city council and the mayor, the strong mayoral form of government. So Barbara Jordan and Curtis Graves had filed that suit back in 1969, 71. Finally comes out at this point, it changes the city council, that's number one. Number two, that determines who's gonna be the stakeholders at the table. And that's when you get blacks and others in city council for the first time, because it didn't kill the at-large system, but it established single-member districts, and single-member districts seemed to work for the indigenous candidate from that community. So that fundamentally changed some things. Another thing changes is the idea, the politics of the state. The politics of the state became triracial. If you look at the book by Chandler Davidson, he talks about that the big winners starting in the 70s became Mexican Americans or so-called Hispanics, depending on what county you were from, you see. But if you think about this, if you look at who won statewide, the border counties, for example, Mexican Americans started to win office down there, and the old guard were kind of voted out along that. So you begin to see a systemic change. The supreme irony of Houston is that San Antonio was always a triracial city in terms of how they did things. You know, it was always one. And they had blacks on the police force, just like Houston, going back. They didn't go back as far, but in terms of the 20th century, they always had an African American on the force and a Mexican American on the force. And they saw value in that, you see. Houston will develop that idea after 1969, 70, the use of that strategically. But I must say something to you. Every public institution has with it a very conservative character, institutionally. And because of that, it develops a culture of its own, and that culture of its own, and that's endemic in all public institutions of certain kinds. Now, for lack of a better term, healthcare may be a bit more liberal, but institutions like fire, police, and others like that tend to be very conservative organizations and very static going forward. So once they do make a change, it is hard for them to make another change, and it takes a while for that change to occur. Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
Couple things. I think we're probably asking what happened with Carlos Elliott in terms of how his colleagues reacted.
Yeah, what did brother do to him?
But interestingly enough, within 7-8 years, he went through a really tough time. Not just him, but he had a brother on the police department I worked with. He actually went through a tough time, which was terribly unfair because of his brother. But Carlos was, within about 7 years of that incident, was actually elected or nominated and voted as Officer of the Year by his colleagues in the police department for the union that I was a member of at the time. And then later on, he became a pretty well-respected homicide investigator.
Yeah. Because he was, what was strange about Carlos, initially he was fired and then brought back.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He got his job back through civil service.
Through civil service, that's it. And I'm sorry, I'm glad you brought that up. Civil service reform was the biggest thing that comes in. Thanks for bringing that up, because that was one of the bigger political things that happened.
But he recovered well. I mean, his colleagues did not, in the end, did not hold any of that against him.
Yeah.
The second thing was that I always thought that one of the biggest culprits, aside from the police officers that were involved in that mess, was the city of Houston, because the city of Houston had in the jail a clinic that was used for storage. They stored paper and whatnot in it.
It sure did.
And because they were so cheap, and they wouldn't fund a 24-hour medical facility, and not major stuff, but I'm talking about what was wrong with your brother when he came in. Had they had that clinic available at the time, this thing, we would have moved on down there. It would have never happened. because of that. And after this issue, they opened that thing up all of a sudden. Now they have 24-hour.
24-hour medical. They actually started with a nurse, and first a male nurse, then they systematically worked in a female nurse with a clinic supervisor. But initially, the clinic was a storehouse.
Yeah.
I would just say, speaking kind of broadly about the history of Houston, and this is a personal tragedy, obviously, and it affects a lot of people's lives. But in the big picture of Houston history, one thing we have to know is that institutions are products of their times, and no matter if they move slowly or not, if we don't understand that
Yes.
context around the city, we can't understand the potential for change. But the other part is that I think the Campos case does bring attention to the fact that Houston is not historically a Latino community. Of all the cities in the big cities in Texas, it was very, very late. And so that ability to kind of move to a kind of a multi-racial approach to most instances, including this one, was made difficult because it was seen as a biracial community
Yes.
for a really long time. And that's very, very important to understand. Now when we think about Houston and we think about its diversity, we think about, first and foremost, the size of the Latino community here and assume that that's always been the case when it hasn't.
No.
So I think that case, again, beyond the personal tragedies which are foremost, opens up our eyes to ask those larger questions about how does this community change at this time. And we tend to focus often too narrowly on the economic transformation, what's happening with the oil industry, so forth and so on, that are important, but we're also forgetting that as the community is beginning to change, its institutions are going to have to adjust to that in some way. And some do it very well, some don't do it. Oftentimes you can look at the city council, and it's kind of a bellwether in seeing a little bit how representation changes. But I think that's why a story like this, for anyone studying Houston or has to look at as a key issue. So I'm only kind of bringing it up. I'm the historian, that's how I think. So I have to.
But I think it's important to look at it that way, because why does change occur is going to be the question. And why does change occur when how does change occur when race is a critical barrier to that change? And that's a really important question to look at. But here's something that almost very few people know. In 1920, they were boosting Houston as an international city. And we don't become an international city, y'all, until 1990s. You know,
That's the ship challenge.
you know, but yeah.
And legitimately,
Yeah.
from that. We have to
Yes, sir.
remind that
Yes, sir.
Just a very specific question. Do you know what ended up happening with the whole, like, how long did it take for that to stop being this place that police officers would take people to beat them? You know what I'm
That ended.
was
That ended right there. Actually, you still had fights with people doing arrests, and you have well-publicized fights doing that, but you didn't have anything like that occur within the police department. You did have some well-publicized things in the jail that occurred. And again, he brings it out. It's usually individual officers and not a systemic problem, institutionalized problem within it. The big change again comes in 83, 84, when there's an effort to implement a different kind of policing in Houston. And remnants of that still exist. There still are kind of satellite offices and things of that nature, and that they do work to a certain degree because it does put police closer to the people that they serve, you know. But it does not work like it does in other larger metropolitan areas. And even in those large metropolitan areas, there's a disconnect culturally and socially to the people that you serve. Thank you. Anybody else?
Thanks, Dr. Wright.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.